What if the rumours were true, not the harmless kind, the ones too strange, too scandalous, too rotten to believe, from royal mistresses hidden in mansions to whispered payoffs, secret children and velvet-wrapped power plays? These aren't tabloid tales, they're history, verified, documented, ugly. For centuries, monarchies ruled with a smile and a shadow. Today, we're pulling back the curtain, because behind every crown is a cover-up. And sometimes, the palace is just a very expensive lie. Welcome to 25 disgusting royal rumours that turned out to be true. Before we dive in, if you're into unsettling truths, royal rot, and the kind of history that makes your skin crawl, hit subscribe and stay twisted with us. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila, 3 a.m. in Manchester. We see you, fellow night creatures. Let's begin. 1. Edward VIII. There's a difference between being naive and being willfully enthralled. Edward VIII, the king who loved a woman so much he gave up a throne, was also the king who loved an ideology so dangerous he had to be quietly escorted out of history. For years, polite society chose to remember him as the doomed romantic, the king who couldn't wear the crown because it didn't fit alongside Wallis Simpson's hat boxes. The press clung to the image of a man in exile, wandering gardens in the south of France with a cocktail in hand, the tragic casualty of constitutional rigidity. But behind the silk curtains and the sunlit snapshots was a whisper, not about love, but about allegiance, a whisper that became a roar, and then finally a record. The rumour was simple and devastating. Edward VIII, even after his abdication, had disturbing sympathies with Adolf Hitler's regime. Not just diplomatic handshakes or shared courtesies, actual admiration, maybe even complicity. At first, these suspicions were written off as gossip, the invention of political enemies or the embellishment of wartime paranoia. After all, how could a British king, even a former one, possibly align himself with the enemy? It felt almost sacrilegious to suggest. But royalty has always relied on the illusion of virtue, and Edward was its most fragile vessel. In 1937, barely a year after he handed over the throne to his stammering younger brother, Edward and Wallis took a little holiday to Germany. They met Hitler in person, smiled, shook hands. The photographs were easy enough to rationalize. A former monarch on a charm tour. But charm for whom? Hitler called him a good man, and that was the nicest thing he said about any British royal. As it turns out, the Führer had a plan, one that involved Edward returning to the throne after a German victory, but even that could have been dismissed as posturing. What couldn't be dismissed were the documents. Declassified after the war and buried for decades in diplomatic vaults, the Marburg files revealed a cold and unsettling calculus. Operation Willy, a Nazi plot to kidnap Edward and use him as a puppet king, wasn't fantasy. It was paperwork, typed, signed, archived. The files paint a portrait of a man who didn't just tolerate fascism, but toyed with it like a bored cat pawing at a flame. In private communications, Edward criticised the British government's bombing of German cities and suggested peace talks. One message revealed he thought continued resistance would only lead to the destruction of the civilized world. In other words, maybe we should all get along. Maybe they're not so bad. He wasn't alone in his elitist flirtation with authoritarianism. Plenty of aristocrats found the order and uniforms very reassuring in a world slipping toward modernity. But Edward had something more dangerous than just bad taste: legitimacy. In exile, he still held symbolic power, and symbols can be lethal. The British government knew it. That's why they shipped him off to the Bahamas during the war, giving him the ceremonial role of governor and getting him as far away from Europe, microphones and messengers as humanly possible. Officially, it was duty. Unofficially, it was containment. Even after the war, Edward never quite disavowed his opinions. He claimed to be misunderstood, misquoted, a victim of historical revision. But the archives didn't lie. Neither did the guest books, the dinner invitations, or the telegrams with awkward stamps. He wasn't an innocent abroad. He was a man who believed quietly and carelessly that democracy was a fragile and overrated thing. And that's what makes his story not just disgusting, but dangerous. Because in Edward's case, the truth was never buried deep. It was out there in the open, just carefully wrapped in silk and silence. The kind of truth that tells you how easily a crown can slide off a man's head and land in someone else's hands entirely. For a long time, the British public preferred the fairy tale, the lovesick king, the woman who changed everything, the sacrifice of a monarch for a kiss. It was easier than facing what was really lost when Edward stepped down. Not just a title, but a glimpse into how close the British throne came to being aligned with fascism. Not as a victim, but as a partner, which brings us, somewhat awkwardly, to another king with an inconvenient affection, not for a regime, but for a religion that could have cost him everything, and nearly did. 2. George IV. He was bloated, flamboyant, and frequently drunk, a man whose life was so indulgent that even the cartoons of his time couldn't exaggerate it, because reality had already lapped satire. George IV of the United Kingdom, once Prince Regent, eventually King, was a living parody of monarchy, powdered, perfumed, and perpetually in trouble. His scandals were so numerous they had to queue, but one in particular clung to him like a bad wig: the secret marriage, the Catholic one. For decades it floated through the halls of history like smoke in a candlelit ballroom, whispered by servants, hinted at in memoirs, and quietly dismissed by court loyalists. Surely not, they said. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was illegal. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 forbade any royal from marrying without the monarch's consent, and marrying a Catholic could endanger the very succession. The whole idea sounded like one of George's many drunken escapades, no more real than his claimed military heroism or his waistline. But the whispers wouldn't die. They circled around a name: Maria Fitzherbert. A twice-widowed Roman Catholic of respectable background, but not remotely royal and not remotely Protestant. She was the kind of woman George IV was never supposed to marry, which is, of course, exactly what made her irresistible. The rumor was that they had been married in secret in 1785, years before George was ever officially tied to Caroline of Brunswick, his disastrous public match. The ceremony, it was said, had been intimate, quiet, and utterly illegal, because the law didn't care about candlelight or oaths. Without the king's permission, and especially with the bride being Catholic, the marriage was null and void from the start. Still, George clung to Maria like a guilty conscience. He referred to her as his wife in private, kept portraits of her close, and made sure she had a generous annuity once he was forced into his arranged marriage. When he eventually became king, he reportedly attempted to have their secret union recognized in some subtle, unofficial way, but the political risk was too great. The marriage remained buried under layers of polite denial and bureaucratic silence. For years, defenders of the crown wrote the whole thing off as fantasy, sentimental embellishment, a royal affair elevated to something more by romantics and revisionists. Maria Fitzherbert herself, perhaps tired of the implication that she had merely been a royal mistress, maintained that a real wedding had taken place. But without proof, her claims were little more than perfume in the air, pleasant, suggestive, and unsubstantial. Then came the letters, the wills, the tucked-away papers in the royal archives, and the royal collection. By the late 19th and 20th centuries, researchers began unearthing concrete evidence that the ceremony had in fact occurred. It had been arranged in secrecy and officiated by a clergyman willing to ignore the inconvenient legality of the act. There was a ring, a vow, a binding, at least in the eyes of those present. Of course, the state still considered it null. George's marriage to Caroline, despite being a spectacular disaster, was the only one that counted in constitutional terms. But the personal bond to Maria and the ceremony that created it were very real. It wasn't just pillow talk, it was a violation, a romantic and legal trespass that threatened the already fragile stability of the monarchy. What makes the story especially rich is George's own hypocrisy. While publicly parading as the protector of Protestant succession, he privately risked it all for a Catholic love match. He lived in fear of discovery, and yet refused to let her go. He buried the marriage, but not the woman. Maria, for her part, seems to have genuinely loved him, or at least pitied him, which in George IV's case was close enough. She outlived him, declined burial beside him, and carefully managed the posthumous revelations so that history would eventually know she wasn't just a footnote. When the truth finally rose to the surface, through archives, memoirs, and the pried-open safes of royal secrecy, it didn't cause a revolution, but it did leave a long, lingering stain, not because it was so shocking, but because it had been hidden so carefully. A king had broken the rules not just of protocol, but of succession, and then forced the nation to pretend he hadn't. The entire monarchy, it turns out, was willing to look the other way, as long as it didn't make the papers, which, ironically, brings us to another royal whose private affairs were never meant to be heard in public. But then someone hit record. And that's only the beginning. If you're still here, eyes wide, maybe a little disturbed, you're exactly our kind of viewer. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss what's still lurking down this royal rabbit hole. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it where you are? Are you binging this at sunrise or doom scrolling at 2 a.m? We won't judge. We're right there with you. 3. Charles and Camilla. There are few things more British than a scandal wrapped in denial, dipped in irony, and served with tea. Enter the long, awkward, publicly whispered relationship between Charles and Camilla, the affair that everyone knew about but no one could quite prove, until one night the phone lines gave up trying to keep secrets. For years, Camilla was the ghost at the royal banquet. Always nearby, never quite acknowledged. She was the not-quite ex, the friend, the hunting companion, the laughing presence at polo matches. The woman Charles was allegedly just very fond of, even while married to Diana, who once famously said there were 3 of us in that marriage. The British press danced around it, gossip columnists threw shade with surgical precision, and the palace smiled like a hostage. The rumours were thick, but rumours are easy to deny until they aren't. It was called Camillagate. Later, more cruelly, Tampongate. It began as a rumour and ended as a tabloid apocalypse. In December 1992, a grainy, staticky recording of an intimate phone call between Charles and Camilla surfaced in the media, supposedly taped years earlier in 1989. The call was never meant for public consumption, which of course is exactly why it was consumed ravenously. In the call, the two exchanged not just affections, but a level of familiarity that left absolutely no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. It was banal, embarrassing, and most damningly authentic. This was not courtship. This was not noble. It was real, messy, and uncomfortably human. For all the years of denial, of elegant evasions and stiff upper lips, the tape confirmed what everyone already suspected but couldn't prove. The future king had been carrying on with Camilla Parker Bowles long before his marriage officially dissolved. For the monarchy, which relies heavily on illusion and restraint, it was catastrophic. Not just because of the affair itself, but because of how ordinary it all sounded. The call wasn't regal, it wasn't elevated, it was domestic, familiar, absurd. And in that absurdity, the public got a rare, unvarnished look behind the curtain of Buckingham Palace. Not myth, not majesty, just awkward, middle-aged flirtation between two people who clearly never stopped being in love, or at least in codependency. The palace didn't deny the tape. It couldn't, but it also didn't explain it. The official silence was deafening, filled only by tabloid echo chambers and late-night comedy monologues. Charles's image took a dive so steep it's a miracle he remained upright. Camilla, who had been little more than a whispered name in the footnotes of Diana's tragedy, became public enemy number 2, behind Charles himself. She was cast as the homewrecker, the interloper, the woman who didn't play by the script. But the truth was far more nuanced and, like most royal truths, inconvenient. Charles and Camilla had known each other long before Diana entered the picture. Their relationship had history, chemistry, and a tragic dose of bad timing. Royal expectations and royal image management had forced Charles into a more suitable marriage, which crumbled under the weight of expectation, incompatibility, and press hysteria. Still, until that tape surfaced, the affair was technically unconfirmed. Whispered about, certainly. Loathed by Diana, undoubtedly, but without proof. And then suddenly the proof was there, not in a court filing or a diary, but in Charles's own voice, betraying not just his vows, but his practiced discretion. What followed was a slow-motion collapse of public trust, not just in Charles, but in the fantasy of royal fidelity. For all the centuries of monarchs cheating, lying, and dissolving marriages for political gain, the modern public had wanted to believe in something more idealistic. Diana had embodied that illusion. The tape burned it down. And yet, the monarchy did what it always does when cornered by truth. It waited. Time passed. Diana's death reframed the story. The years softened the public's rage. Slowly, cautiously, Charles and Camilla re-entered public life together, no longer a secret but still not fully embraced. By the time they were married in 2005, the scandal was old news, though not forgotten. What made the entire episode so grotesque wasn't just the betrayal, it was the performance. The years of insisting there was nothing improper, the staged photo ops, the coy language, all undone by a single recorded conversation. It wasn't just a confirmation of infidelity, it was a collapse of credibility. But perhaps the most quietly scandalous part of all, Charles got to keep everything. The title, the throne, the image. Camilla is now queen, not queen consort, not footnote, not shameful whisper, and the entire royal machinery has been repackaged, reminted, and reintroduced like none of it ever happened. A scandal that would have ended a career in any other job became, in the royal sphere, merely an awkward chapter in a long public rehabilitation. But not all scandals end with rebranding. Some leave a scar deep enough to remove a royal entirely from public life. Just ask his brother. 4. Prince Andrew. There's a certain irony in being called His Royal Highness, while the entire nation wishes you'd just quietly vanish. Prince Andrew, once known for his dashing military career and energetic diplomacy, now resides in a public limbo, not officially exiled, not exactly retired, but very much removed. The journey from palace ballroom to persona non grata didn't happen overnight, but the descent began and ultimately collapsed around a rumor that refused to die, that Andrew's friendship with financier Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just unwise, it was irreparably damning. For years, it was whispered, then shouted, that Andrew had a habit of surrounding himself with dubious company. At first, it was chalked up to poor judgment. "He's just naive," said the sympathetic few. "He's a bit too trusting." But that narrative crumbled like wet wallpaper once photos emerged. There he was, the Queen's second son, laughing in Central Park beside Epstein after the financier's release from prison. Not just once, but in multiple visits, despite Epstein's now public reputation for trafficking and abuse. This was not a friend who had fallen from grace. This was a man who had been buried in disgrace, exhumed by the courts, and still somehow maintained access to a British royal. And Andrew, impossibly, didn't walk away. He stayed connected. Why? The rumours evolved into full-scale headlines by the late 2010s, when a woman named Virginia Giuffre publicly alleged that she had been trafficked by Epstein and coerced into encounters with powerful men, Andrew among them. The palace dismissed the allegations. Andrew denied them outright. His team insisted there was no recollection, no involvement, no truth. But the story wouldn't go away. It wasn't just Virginia's word. There was the infamous photograph. Andrew with his arm wrapped around her waist, smiling beside Ghislaine Maxwell. She looked like a teenager. He looked like he was having a grand time. The photograph was like a splinter, small, simple, but impossible to ignore. And then came the interview. In an effort to clear his name, or perhaps just demonstrate astonishing public relations malpractice, Andrew sat down with the BBC in 2019. It was, by all accounts, a disaster. Over the course of nearly an hour, he offered one of the strangest alibis in royal history, that he couldn't have been with Giuffre on the night in question because he had taken his daughter to a Pizza Express in Woking. He also insisted that he didn't sweat, due to a temporary medical condition stemming from the Falklands War. This was the caliber of defense presented to the public, a pizza chain and a phantom medical diagnosis. The palace winced, the public recoiled, and the damage was instant. Within days, Andrew announced that he would step back from public duties, a polite way of saying he had been quietly shoved out a side door. Charities dropped him. Universities revoked honours. Official functions removed his name from programmes. He wasn't stripped of his titles, not yet, but the machinery of royalty began moving on without him. In 2022, facing a civil suit in US court, Andrew did not go to trial. He settled. Privately, no admission of guilt, no public reckoning, but the agreement included a substantial financial payment and a statement vaguely supporting Giuffre's rights as a victim, an odd gesture from someone maintaining innocence. The palace tried to repackage it as a gesture of mercy, a wish to move on, but few believed it was anything but strategy, and still the silence continues. Andrew is rarely seen. He was quietly removed from his military titles and stripped of his honorary affiliations. His HRH styling was no longer used in any official capacity. But the royal family stopped just short of full disavowal. He remains, awkwardly, the Duke of York, a title now whispered more often than spoken. What makes the Andrew affair so corrosive isn't just the nature of the allegations, it's the brazenness, the clumsiness, the shocking indifference to optics. In a family obsessed with image and protocol, Andrew seemed to float above consequence for far too long. The public asked questions, the press dug deeper, the palace stonewalled, and when the walls finally cracked, what spilled out was a portrait of entitlement so baked in it could not be scrubbed clean. And yet, despite everything, there he remains. Not in exile, not in disgrace, but somewhere in the purgatory of the deeply protected. The scandal may have closed the chapter, but the bookmark still sits firmly in place. Which brings us to another royal whose secret was far more personal, but no less disruptive. A child hidden not in shame, but in legal ambiguity, and whose existence would rewrite the story of a nation's monarchy. 5. King Albert II, Belgium. Royal families tend to treat bloodlines the way bankers treat vaults, meticulously sealed, alarmed, and regularly audited. Lineage is everything. Succession, legitimacy, titles, all flow from the cold precision of parentage. So when whispers began echoing through Belgium that King Albert II had fathered a child out of wedlock, it wasn't just a personal matter. It was a constitutional one, a quiet earthquake under the marble floors of a monarchy. For years, Delphine Boel was a name that lingered on the outskirts of tabloid columns and late-night talk shows, introduced as a Belgian artist with a peculiar origin story. She had always maintained, quietly at first and then more firmly, that she was the biological daughter of King Albert II, born from a long-running affair with her mother, Baroness Sibylle de Salis Longchamp. The claim was dismissed, waved off by royal courtiers, as another eccentric media fabrication. After all, it's not uncommon for monarchs to attract false claims of secret offspring. It's practically a genre. But Delphine wasn't interested in scandal. She was after recognition, not a crown, not a title, not a throne, just truth. The whispers started in the 1990s, growing louder after King Albert took the throne in 1993. Journalists poked around the timeline. Delphine's mother had, by her own account, had a close relationship with Albert before his ascension, back when he was still the Prince of Liège. She described a deep emotional bond that had lasted for nearly 2 decades. When Delphine was born in 1968, the dates raised eyebrows. Still, the palace stood firm. Silence. No comment. The king, usually reserved, ignored the speculation altogether. And for a while it worked. The story simmered without boiling over. Delphine lived her life outside the royal spotlight, building a career as an artist, occasionally granting interviews that were more melancholic than explosive. She seemed less interested in royalty and more wounded by the denial, by the quiet refusal to even engage with her claim. But the world changed. In 2013, Albert abdicated in favor of his son, Philippe, citing health concerns. Abdication, however, stripped him of certain immunities. Delphine saw an opportunity not for revenge, but for resolution. She launched a legal battle, not against the monarchy, but against the man she believed to be her father. It was a brutal, protracted affair. Royal lawyers insisted the claim was baseless. Supporters of the monarchy rolled their eyes at what they painted as a publicity stunt, but Delphine refused to vanish. In 2018, after years of legal wrangling, the Belgian court ordered Albert to submit to a DNA test. He refused. The deadline passed. Fines were levied. The refusal made headlines. And the optics, a former king defying a court order to avoid a paternity test, did more damage than any tabloid headline ever could. Finally, in early 2020, Albert relented. The DNA test was conducted. The results were definitive. Delphine Boel was indeed his biological daughter. The rumor, long treated as a sideshow, was now an irrefutable fact. Belgium, polite, restrained, legally obsessed Belgium, had to absorb the awkward truth. A king had a secret daughter. The denial had collapsed under the weight of science, and the monarchy, so careful about its image, had been caught in a lie of omission. But what happened next was stranger still. Rather than retreating from the moment, Delphine pressed forward. She petitioned for official recognition, not for money, not for status, but for legitimacy. The courts agreed. In October 2020, she was legally recognized as a princess with the surname of Belgium and the right to use the title Her Royal Highness. Her 2 children were also granted noble status. It was, in its own quiet way, revolutionary. A woman once cast aside as a footnote to a rumor became a royal in the law books. But what made the story quietly devastating was not just the DNA or the royal response, it was the decades spent in silence. The years where truth sat outside the palace gates, knocking politely, waiting to be let in. Albert issued a statement, terse, formal, devoid of warmth. He acknowledged the results, but offered little else. No apology, no emotional reconciliation, just a closing of a legal file. But Delphine, perhaps more gracious than the institution that denied her, said she hoped for healing, that she wanted nothing but peace, which, for a family that built its dynasty on inheritance and protocol, was the one thing they never seemed able to offer her. Still, her victory wasn't just personal. It cracked the armor of royal myth. It proved that even behind the polished smiles and practiced ceremonies, a monarch could be caught lying about something as elemental as fatherhood. And if a royal bloodline could be rewritten by a lab test and a courtroom, what else might be hiding under the wallpaper of Europe's gilded palaces? The answer, at least in one particular case, turned out to be even more transactional. It wasn't about family, it was about money. And it took us straight into the cockpit of one of Europe's sleaziest aviation scandals.
6.
Prince Bernhard, Netherlands. If royalty is supposed to float above corruption, serenely detached from money, greed and grubby backroom deals, then Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was a particularly heavy exception. He didn't float, he negotiated, manoeuvred and occasionally took meetings in hotel rooms that smelled like aircraft oil and quiet bribes. While Europe reinvented itself after the Second World War, Bernhard seemed perfectly comfortable operating in that murky, unlit corridor between public service and private opportunity. The whispers started in the 1970s that Bernhard, consort to Queen Juliana, father to Queen Beatrix, and one-time Nazi Party member turned Allied war hero, had accepted a suspiciously large sum of money from an American defense contractor. The company was Lockheed. The stakes were sky-high, a multi-million-dollar jet contract. The rumors had a greasy logic to them. Lockheed had already been implicated in bribery scandals across several countries, including Japan and Italy, and the Dutch deal, well, it reeked of royal fingerprints. But in the beginning, as always, it was just tattle, suggestive, unconfirmed. The Netherlands, not known for royal melodrama, recoiled at the idea that its dashing prince, the man who wore uniforms like tailored armor and spoke in perfect polished sentences, might be pocketing cash from weapons deals. It was too vulgar, too transactional, and far too American. Still, questions were raised. The Dutch Parliament, sceptical but cautious, began an inquiry, a slow one, the kind of bureaucratic sleuthing that favored paperwork over confrontation. Bernhard, meanwhile, denied everything. His image remained intact. He continued flying around the world in military dress, launching wildlife conservation initiatives and shaking hands with generals. His official role was mostly ceremonial by then, but his unofficial influence lingered in the margins, especially where defense contracts were concerned. Then came the leaks. Internal Lockheed memos, exposed by a US Senate investigation in 1975, included some rather pointed details. They referenced payments to a high-level Dutch official, coded but not cleverly, and specified amounts that suggested serious intent. The finger pointed not just at the Dutch military establishment, but directly at Prince Bernhard himself. The Dutch government couldn't ignore it any longer. Queen Juliana was reportedly devastated. Behind the scenes, there were tense palace meetings, contingency planning, and heated debates about how to preserve the monarchy's credibility without triggering a constitutional crisis. The investigation intensified. More documents emerged. The numbers matched. Eventually, Bernhard was forced to do something almost unheard of in royal circles: step back. In 1976, under mounting pressure and overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Bernhard resigned from a slew of public positions, including his cherished military advisory roles. He agreed not to speak publicly about the Lockheed affair and promised never to be involved in similar negotiations again. It wasn't an admission of guilt, not officially, but it wasn't a denial either. The Dutch press, restrained but not blind, took the hint, but the real confession came later. In 2002, 5 years after his wife Juliana's death and just 2 years before his own, Bernhard granted an interview, posthumously published, in which he finally admitted he had taken the money. Yes, he said, Lockheed had paid him, but it was for the good of the country naturally, a kind of unofficial facilitation. He had, he claimed, resisted bribes from Northrop, a competing defense contractor, so in a way he had shown restraint. It was, he suggested, all very principled. The public was less convinced. By then, the monarchy had survived, obliged, bruised, but intact. Juliana had abdicated. Beatrix was queen. Bernhard was an old man with sunglasses and medals, remembered more for his charisma than his compromises. But the Lockheed scandal had changed something fundamental. It showed that even the most photogenic royal could be tempted, not by love or ideology, but by plain, unromantic cash. What made it all so grotesque wasn't just the money, it was the theatre of denial. the self-righteous speeches, the carefully staged photographs with conservation groups, all while quietly arranging commissions behind the curtain. Bernhard wasn't a monster, but he was a salesman, and in the end he sold something no royal should: the trust of the people. It wasn't just one contract or one misjudgment, it was a systemic flaw in the fairy tale, a reminder that noble blood doesn't insulate a person from very ignoble habits. And if a prince could be bought for a fighter jet, what else might be up for sale behind the palace gates? That question wasn't rhetorical, because just a few countries south, another royal was about to confirm that not even fatherhood had to follow protocol, especially when the truth came wrapped in paternity suits and press conferences. 7. Prince Albert, Monaco. For a man born into one of Europe's most photographed royal families, complete with Hollywood pedigree, casino wealth, and all the soft gold trappings of Mediterranean monarchy, Prince Albert of Monaco has always carried himself with a slightly apologetic air. A man perpetually walking into the room just after the scandal, already holding a press release. The son of Prince Rainier III and Grace Kelly, Albert was raised under the flattering lens of elegance and old money. But even under those camera lights, there was a rumor that followed him like a shadow cast at noon. For years, quiet speculation surrounded his personal life. Despite a revolving door of tabloid-documented romances, models, actresses, Olympic swimmers, Albert, well into adulthood and reigning over a microstate obsessed with lineage, remained unmarried. This wouldn't have been particularly unusual in most circles, but Monaco isn't most circles. The Grimaldi dynasty, as tiny as it is, relies on continuity. The bloodline matters. The throne must always have a body to sit on it. And Monaco, lacking the robust constitutional scaffolding of larger monarchies, depends more than most on the image of its sovereign as stable, present, and preferably accompanied by legitimate heirs. So when rumors began to swell that Albert had fathered a child, not with a royal, not with a noblewoman, not even with a long-term partner, but with an air hostess, the palace did what royal palaces tend to do. It pretended the story didn't exist. At first, the denials came through omission. No statements, no engagement with the press, just silence, which was meant to feel like dignity, but increasingly smelled like damage control. The woman in question, Nicole Coste, a former Air France flight attendant originally from Togo, was not a public figure. But her child, Alexandra, born in 2003, slowly became the focus of a media tug-of-war. Nicole claimed that Albert was the father. She provided details, timelines, letters, photographs, private conversations. And yet, the palace remained inert. It wasn't so much a refusal to acknowledge as it was a refusal to respond. For a time, this tactic worked. The story plateaued, becoming just another semi-believable rumor about a bachelor prince in a coastal tax haven. Then, in 2005, everything changed. Faced with mounting public pressure, increasingly credible legal claims, and the awkward reality that he was about to ascend the throne following his father's death, Prince Albert did something rare in royal history. He confessed. Through a carefully worded statement from the palace, he acknowledged paternity. Alexandra was his son. The announcement was both groundbreaking and strangely muted. There was no dramatic apology, no televised admission, just confirmation, cold, legal, almost sterile. The palace emphasized that the child would have no claim to the throne, in accordance with Monaco's succession laws, which require that heirs be born in wedlock to spouses formerly married to the sovereign. Still, the symbolic weight of the admission was seismic, and then, as if that weren't enough palace intrigue for one news cycle, another revelation followed. A young American woman named Tamara Rotolo, who had long claimed that Albert was the father of her daughter, Jasmine Grace Grimaldi, also received royal recognition. Jasmine had been born in 1992, and her mother had filed a paternity suit in California in the 90s. one that had largely been ignored or downplayed. But now, with precedent set and silence no longer an option, Albert acknowledged her too. 2 children, born to 2 women, both out of wedlock, both denied for years, suddenly real, documented and official. To be clear, neither child was ever treated as scandalous by the public. Jasmine Grace, in particular, has grown into a poised public presence. The controversy was never about them. It was about the institutional dishonesty that surrounded their existence, about the palace's attempt to control the narrative long after the narrative had escaped their grasp. Albert's eventual marriage to Princess Charlene in 2011 brought with it the image of stability the monarchy had craved for decades, but even that has not gone without rumour. Their relationship has been the subject of its own speculation, separate from Albert's past, yet inevitably framed by it. Still, with the birth of twins Jacques and Gabriella in 2014, the succession crisis was neatly, if somewhat belatedly, resolved. What makes this particular royal rumour so unsettling isn't the paternity itself. Royals throughout history have sired children in secrecy. What's different here is the context, the modernity of it, the lawsuits, the DNA tests, the press conferences, the fact that a royal figure had to confront in real time the limits of reputation management in the digital age. Albert could no longer hide behind tradition. Monaco is too small and the world is too loud. His attempts at secrecy weren't just ineffective, they were insulting. They suggested that legitimacy, dignity, and royal decorum were more important than truth or acknowledgement or basic emotional decency. And just as one royal family came to terms with hidden bloodlines, another, much larger, was busy doing the opposite, allowing corruption to trickle down from the crown itself right into the family ledger. 8. Iñaki Urdangarin. It started, as most royal embarrassments do, with a smile. Iñaki Urdangarin, Olympic athlete, polished in-laws, perfectly square jaw, was the kind of man you put on a postage stamp. Tall, handsome, fluent in multiple languages, and married to a Spanish princess. In 1997, when he wed Infanta Cristina, the youngest daughter of King Juan Carlos I, it looked like something out of a carefully produced constitutional fairy tale. The House of Bourbon had modernized. A commoner in name, but elite in bearing, Urdangarin was supposed to represent a new chapter in the monarchy's story. Elegant, athletic, apolitical. The royal son-in-law who never made waves. Then came the rumour. Spain, like most monarchies still clinging to ceremonial relevance, is allergic to overt scandal. The family was already under scrutiny. Whispers about King Juan Carlos's lifestyle, his finances, his hobbies. But Urdangarin was a fresh face, unsullied, or at least that was the theory. Beneath the PR was a paper trail, a long one. The first signs surfaced around 2006 with quiet reports about the Nuos Institute, a non-profit that Urdangarin co-founded and ran with a former business partner, Diego Torres. Officially, NOS existed to promote sports and social programs through public-private partnerships. Unofficially, it was doing something far more lucrative, charging exorbitant fees for organizing events, then allegedly siphoning off public funds into shell companies. The initial response was predictable: denial, dismissal, confusion. The palace insisted there was no wrongdoing. Urdangarin released a statement expressing shock at the allegations and confidence in the judicial process. He was calm, articulate, deferential, the kind of tone lawyers adore. For a while it worked. After all, how could the king's son-in-law be involved in something so pedestrian as white-collar embezzlement? But the investigation continued and the evidence piled up. Documents, invoices, emails, the kind of paper evidence that even royal immunity can't wave away. Prosecutors alleged that Urdangarin used his royal connections to win public contracts, then funneled around $6 million into private hands, his own and others. The Noose Institute, once cloaked in idealistic language about sports and civic unity, was recast as a front. The scandal burst into full daylight in 2011. Urdangarin was officially named a suspect. The news ignited Spain's already simmering debate about the relevance and integrity of the monarchy. The economy was in crisis, unemployment was high, austerity measures were cutting deep, and now the royal family, the supposed symbol of national continuity, was accused of quietly cashing in on the taxpayer's dime. The backlash was swift. In 2012, the palace, clearly spooked, removed Urdangarin from its official website and announced he would no longer participate in royal functions. He and Princess Christina moved to Switzerland with their children, a polite form of exile disguised as discretion. But exile doesn't erase a case file. In 2016, he went on trial. The proceedings were a parade of reputational collapse. Businessmen testified, emails were dissected, lawyers squabbled. Urdangarin sat in the courtroom, stripped of his medals and PR sheen, no longer a prince-in-law, but a defendant. The Spanish public watched, some horrified, others grimly satisfied. Justice was rarely this photogenic. In 2017, he was found guilty of multiple counts, including fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. His sentence, 6 years and 3 months in prison. He appealed. The court reduced it slightly to 5 years and 10 months, but upheld the core conviction. He began serving time in 2018. And what of Princess Christina? She became the first Spanish royal to stand trial in modern history. Although ultimately acquitted, the court found she had benefited from the fraud, albeit unknowingly. The acquittal did little to rehabilitate her image. For many Spaniards, the idea that she had no idea what her husband was doing with millions of euros strained credibility. The monarchy was shaken. King Juan Carlos abdicated in 2014, citing his son's readiness to lead, but few missed the subtext. The scandals had become too much. Felipe VI, the new king, wasted no time drawing lines. He renounced any inheritance from his father, stripped Christina of her Duchess of Parma title, and tried valiantly to restore some shine to the tarnished crown. Urdangarin was released from prison in stages, benefiting from Spain's semi-flexible penal system for white-collar offenders. But his name remains radioactive. He is no longer invited to official functions. His marriage to Christina, once a dynastic statement, eventually collapsed. They separated quietly, without drama, as if even the press had grown tired of the spectacle. The Noailles affair didn't just expose financial misconduct. It pulled back the curtain on how the modern monarchy, for all its speeches about duty and service, still trafficked in nepotism and privilege. It was a reminder that behind every ceremonial ribbon cutting there might be a tax shelter, that non-profit doesn't always mean noble, and that even the most elegant surnames can appear on court dockets, which is perhaps why the next royal scandal felt less like a twist and more like a sequel. Same kingdom, different king, same old question. How much does one man need before he breaks the public's patience entirely? 9. King Juan Carlos, Spain. There was a time when King Juan Carlos of Spain could do no wrong, or at least when the world politely agreed to pretend so. He was the monarch who brought democracy back to Spain after the long shadow of Franco, the crowned savior of the constitutional order, the man who stood firm during the 1981 coup attempt and reportedly told the military to go home, with a uniformed glare and a firmly royal voice. For decades, that moment secured his legend. But then came the rumors. Quiet at first, whispers in diplomatic circles, murmurs among journalists, raised eyebrows in elite Spanish salons. That maybe the king wasn't quite the statesman he appeared to be, that there were deals, money, offshore accounts, a lifestyle that stretched to the limits of discretion. It all sounded too cliché to be real, a royal living large, doing backroom business deals, whispering into gold telephones. Spain didn't want to believe it. Spain needed a hero, and so for a while it didn't believe it. The story that finally pierced the illusion began not with finance, but with something far more theatrical: an elephant. In 2012, while the country was enduring a brutal economic crisis, with unemployment soaring and austerity biting into every corner of public life, Juan Carlos vanished from the public eye for a few days. Then, without warning, a photo appeared in the press. The king, in safari gear, standing in front of a dead elephant in Botswana, beaming like a man who had just found a lost golf ball. The photo exploded across Spain like a match in a wine cellar. It wasn't just the image, grotesque, tone-deaf, wildly out of touch. It was the fact that no one had known where he was. The trip had been private, paid for, it was said, by a foreign businessman. While Spaniards tightened their belts and lost their homes, their king had been flying across continents to shoot endangered animals in secret. That alone would have been enough to dent a legacy. But it wasn't the scandal, it was the gateway drug. The elephant photo cracked the aura of untouchability. Suddenly, journalists, now emboldened, began revisiting long-ignored leads: private planes, expensive gifts, undeclared income, friendships with billionaires of ambiguous ethics. And at the center of it all, Corinna Larsen, a Danish-German businesswoman and the king's close companion, whose name had long appeared in gossip columns and diplomatic dispatches alike. Larsen later claimed that Juan Carlos had gifted her vast sums of money, reportedly 65 million, as a kind of gesture of affection or severance, or perhaps something less poetic. Spanish prosecutors and international journalists began digging. Where had the money come from? Why had it moved through Swiss bank accounts? What did Saudi Arabia have to do with it? In 2020, the real blow landed. Swiss prosecutors alleged that Juan Carlos had received a secret payment of $100 million from the Saudi
royal family in 2008 under suspicious circumstances, supposedly linked to a lucrative high-speed rail contract won by Spanish firms. The payment was routed through a foundation in Panama. Corinna was a beneficiary, and so, incidentally, was the king. Now, rumors of money laundering, influence peddling, and offshore wealth weren't just speculative. They were entering legal territory. Spain launched its own investigations. The former king denied wrongdoing, but refused to clarify. The palace, under King Felipe VI, scrambled to distance itself. Felipe renounced any inheritance from his father, cut his allowance, and began a PR campaign of clean monarchy. It was a rebrand by necessity. Meanwhile, Juan Carlos did something that only deepened the public's sense of betrayal. He fled. In August 2020, with legal inquiries circling and media scrutiny intensifying, the former king announced he would leave Spain to help his son. The destination was secret at first, then revealed: Abu Dhabi, a gilded self-exile in a country with a lot of sunshine and very little extradition. From that moment on, the myth unraveled completely. Juan Carlos, once the face of Spain's democratic rebirth, now lived abroad as an unofficial fugitive, technically not charged, but unmistakably dodging the noise. The investigations haven't led to criminal prosecutions, but the reputational damage is permanent. When he finally returned for a brief visit in 2022, it wasn't to applause, it was to awkward silence and quiet protest. The monarchy, of course, still stands, but something broke with Juan Carlos's fall. Not just trust, but tolerance. The idea that a king could do whatever he liked, in total secrecy, with foreign cash and private jets, no longer seemed quaint or harmless. It felt medieval, outrageous, and most dangerous of all, outdated. But this wasn't the first time the House of Windsor's aristocratic cousins had hidden away an inconvenient truth. Sometimes the scandal isn't about money or power. Sometimes it's about family, or the one member they quietly erased. 10. Prince John, United Kingdom. In the grand portrait gallery of the British royal family, some faces are merely faded. Others were never painted at all. One of those missing figures is Prince John, the youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary, a royal ghost whose name rarely appears in official speeches, palace tours, or commemorative tea sets. For decades, his story was a kind of royal rumour itself, that there was once a prince hidden away from the world, quietly erased from the public eye. A boy who vanished before he ever had a chance to be known. At first glance, the idea sounds like one of those Victorian conspiracy theories, that the royals had a secret child locked in an attic like some Gothic novel cliché. But the truth is less theatrical and far more haunting. Prince John existed. He lived, he laughed, he posed for photographs with his siblings, and then, over time, he simply disappeared from the frame. Born in 1905 at York Cottage, Sandringham, John was the sixth and youngest child of the future King George V. By all accounts, he was a bright and lively boy in his early years, mischievous, energetic, fond of jokes and games. But sometime around the age of 4 or 5, his health began to shift. He experienced seizures, his development slowed, he became prone to emotional outbursts and periods of withdrawal. It was later understood to be epilepsy, possibly combined with a developmental or neurological disorder, though the precise diagnosis remains the subject of debate even among historians. And then came the silence. The royal family, ever conscious of image, began to draw a veil around young John. His appearances at public events ceased. His name began to vanish from court bulletins. There was no official announcement, no open explanation. Instead, John was gradually removed from public life and relocated to Wood Farm, a secluded house on the Sandringham estate. He was placed under the care of a governess, Lala Bill, and a small staff. His family visited occasionally, but he was no longer a daily presence in the royal household. For years, this arrangement was framed, when it was discussed at all, as an act of compassion, that John was too delicate for public life, that he was happier in the countryside, that the palace was shielding him from the strain of royal expectation, but the unspoken message was clear. His condition made him inconvenient. Medical knowledge at the time was limited. Epilepsy carried a heavy stigma, often mischaracterized as madness or weakness. In a family obsessed with stability and continuity, John's condition was considered not just tragic, but threatening. The monarchy was built on the performance of perfection, upright airs, unblemished bloodlines, public smiles. A boy with seizures did not fit into that narrative, and so Prince John faded into historical footnote status. When he died in 1919, at the age of 13, following a severe seizure, there was no state funeral, no grand commemoration. He was buried quietly at Sandringham, and the palace issued a brief, dry statement. His death, like his life, was kept at a distance. But the silence didn't hold forever. In the decades that followed, researchers and royal biographers began to piece together his story. Letters from Queen Mary revealed a cold practicality in her reflections on John's death, as if his passing had somehow brought order back to the family's tightly managed image. Some royalists still insist it was simply the norm of the time, that families with disabled or ill children often kept them out of public view, and that the Windsors were no crueler than society itself. But that's the thing about rumours. They often start where explanations end, and in Prince John's case, the gaps were enormous. For years, many people didn't even know he had existed. His life wasn't taught in schools, or mentioned in documentaries, or honoured in family trees. There were no portraits of him at Buckingham Palace, no busts, no royal foundation in his name. When the BBC aired a dramatised film about his life in the 2000s, audiences were shocked to learn that a child of the king had been so thoroughly erased.
It wasn't just a secret, it was an institutional deletion, not because John had done anything wrong, but because he didn't conform to the image of royal robustness. His body, his illness, his unpredictability, these things made him unshowable. Even now, his name is often omitted from casual references to King George V's children. When modern royals speak about mental health and inclusion, they rarely mention their own history, the one that sent a child into seclusion so as not to disrupt the polished public face of empire. It's easy to condemn it now, with the benefit of modern medicine and hindsight. But the truth is harder to digest, that a royal family sworn to duty and service once chose silence over visibility, erasure over acceptance. Prince John was not just hidden, he was almost forgotten. And yet, as history would prove again and again, the royals are rarely free from their ghosts. Because not long after Prince John was tucked away, another imperial court, much larger, much more unstable, was about to open its doors to a holy man with no title, no bloodline, and a level of influence that would end a dynasty.
11. Rasputin and the Russian Court. The story of Rasputin is often told like a fever dream, part horror, part comedy, part political tragedy, but above all, as a cautionary tale about what happens when a monarchy becomes allergic to reality. The Russian imperial family, surrounded by gold domes, fur coats, and enough formality to suffocate a cathedral, found itself seduced not by diplomacy, military prowess, or science, but by a wandering mystic in need of a bath and a haircut. Grigory Rasputin wasn't a nobleman, he wasn't educated, he didn't come from anything resembling a royal lineage. He was a Siberian peasant with intense eyes, a flair for theatrics, and the uncanny ability to convince powerful people that he had access to divine knowledge, and more importantly, divine healing. At first, the idea that such a man could exert influence over the Romanovs, the most powerful royal house in Russia, seemed preposterous. He didn't dress the part, he certainly didn't act the part. He was erratic, unpolished, rumoured to drink too much, talk too freely, and sneak into too many private parties. Court insiders referred to him as the Mad Monk, though he was technically neither mad nor officially ordained. The name stuck anyway because it sounded just insane enough to be true. The rumours began around 1905, when Rasputin first entered the orbit of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. The royal couple had a problem, and it wasn't just political unrest or economic instability. Their son, Alexei, the heir to the throne, had been born with haemophilia, a disorder that caused uncontrollable internal bleeding from even minor injuries. It was a secret illness, known only to a trusted few, but it was a ticking time bomb for the monarchy. An heir who might not live long enough to inherit the throne was more than a personal tragedy. It was a national vulnerability. Then came Rasputin. According to Alexandra's letters and diaries, he had a calming effect on Alexei. During crises, when the boy was on the brink of collapse, Rasputin would arrive, whisper prayers, and somehow, inexplicably, the bleeding would stop. There are modern theories, of course. Some speculate that his calming presence lowered the child's stress levels, which could have helped slow the bleeding. Others point out that he may have encouraged Alexandra to stop certain medical treatments that were doing more harm than good. Whatever the reason, to the desperate empress, it looked like a miracle. And Rasputin, dishevelled, devout, and disturbingly confident, knew exactly how to leverage it. He became a fixture at court, not officially, of course. The Romanovs didn't give him a title or an office, but his influence became undeniable. He had the ear of the empress. He began offering political advice. He weighed in on government appointments. When officials disagreed with him, they were suddenly reassigned. When noblewomen visited the palace, they'd hear Rasputin's voice floating in from behind a curtain, offering unsolicited spiritual counsel. All the while, the Russian public was watching and whispering. By the late 1910s, the perception wasn't just that Rasputin was a healer or a confidant.
It was that he was running the show, that the Tsarina was under his spell, that the monarchy had been compromised from the inside, not by foreign agents, but by a mystic peasant who smelled like garlic and claimed to talk to angels. Satirical newspapers had a field day. Political cartoons showed Rasputin as a puppet master dragging Nicholas and Alexandra by invisible strings. Revolutionary pamphlets accused him of debauchery, treason, and worse. Some of it was propaganda, but not all. His actual reach inside the court was real. His power, though informal, was absolute. The Russian elite, already disillusioned by the monarchy's mishandling of war and famine, began to see Rasputin not as a clownish distraction, but as a symbol of imperial decay. In the eyes of many, Rasputin wasn't just embarrassing, he was radioactive. And so, in 1916, a group of nobles and politicians decided they'd had enough. What followed was one of the most bizarre and over-dramatized political assassinations in European history. But even Rasputin's murder didn't cleanse the monarchy of its problems. It was too late. The empire was cracking. The revolution was inevitable. And when the Romanovs fell in 1917, when the palaces were stormed and the dynasty was dismantled, it wasn't just the fault of war or Lenin or breadlines. It was also about perception. The image of a royal family so out of touch, so desperate for spiritual answers, so gullible that they let a mystic peasant advise on matters of state. That image stuck. It poisoned their legitimacy. What began as a rumor, a joke even, turned out to be entirely true. Rasputin really did have access. He really did influence policy. He really did shape the final years of an empire. And the idea that one unwashed mystic could unravel an empire once thought eternal is unsettling enough, but not as unsettling as what happened next in another royal house where a very different kind of scandal, one involving a very different kind of cover-up, ended not in revolution, but in whispered regrets and an official lie that held for nearly a century.
12. Crown Prince Rudolf, Austria. There's a room in the Mayerling hunting lodge where the wallpaper has been changed, the furniture replaced, the windows sealed. It is quiet now, too quiet for a place once filled with the echo of gunshots, whispered orders, and hastily rewritten royal scripts. This is where Crown Prince Rudolf, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was found dead in 1889 alongside his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera. But for decades, even generations, what actually happened in that room was scrubbed, silenced, and rewritten until the truth became less a matter of record and more a matter of royal taste. At the time, the Habsburg dynasty was one of the grandest families in Europe, laced in brocade, drowning in protocols, and desperately trying to hold together a shaky patchwork empire. Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, was the great dynastic hope, young, handsome, multilingual, liberal-minded, and they, at least officially, loyal. Except, of course, he wasn't. From early adulthood, Rudolf was a man at odds with his dynasty. He disapproved of his father's conservatism, resented the rigidity of court life, and expressed dangerously progressive political ideas in an empire allergic to change. He drank too much, wrote anonymously for radical newspapers, and drifted toward despair. And then there was the matter of his marriage, an unromantic union to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, which collapsed quickly under the weight of infidelity, disease, and emotional distance. So, when it was announced in January 1889 that Rudolf had died suddenly at Mayerling, the explanation offered was as sterile as it was suspicious. He had succumbed to a heart rupture. That was the official line, a vague medical term to paper over something far less tidy. The imperial court, experts in reputation laundering, locked down the story before the body was cold. No questions, no photographs, just a closed coffin and a very firm statement. But even the most obedient newspapers couldn't resist the rumors, and there were many.
Some said it had been a duel, others whispered assassination, others, still more sensationally, hinted at scandalous debauchery of Rudolph's alleged self-destruction in the presence of a much younger mistress. But no one could print that, because under canon law, such an act would have rendered Rudolph ineligible for a church burial, and the Habsburgs could not, under any circumstances, have their only heir denied a Christian grave. That's when the cover-up went from routine to operatic. Within hours of the deaths, the scene at Mayerling was sanitized. Medical reports were edited, servants were sworn to silence, and court officials drafted a new narrative, one more palatable for public consumption. It would be decades before the letters of Mary Wetzera, hidden and then rediscovered in private archives, confirmed the real story, that she and Rudolph had planned a mutual escape from their separate miseries in the most permanent way possible. But even then, the palace had ensured no official record would ever call it what it was. In a particularly surreal twist, Pope Leo XIII granted special dispensation for Rudolph's burial. The reasoning? He had been of unsound mind. It was a theological technicality, but a necessary one. Without it, the heir to the Habsburg throne would have been buried outside the consecrated crypt of the imperial family. So the court declared him temporarily insane, posthumously, conveniently. And yet, no one in Vienna truly believed it. The public, already suspicious of the monarchy's increasing detachment from reality, saw the cracks widen. Mayerling became a symbol, not just of personal tragedy, but of dynastic denial. The empire that claimed moral clarity and divine right couldn't even tell the truth about its own heir. And what's worse, it tried to stage-manage grief like it was a royal parade. The years passed, the empire collapsed, and still Mayerling remained a site of royal discomfort. The hunting lodge was converted into a convent, as if praying over the ruins might exorcise the truth. It didn't. The story never went away. It festered. When the full details finally emerged, from letters, testimonies, and historical reconstructions, the damage was already done, not just to the reputation of Rudolph, but to the very idea of the monarchy as a steward of truth. The scandal had been less in what happened and more in the cover-up, in the bureaucracy of lies, the whitewashed death certificate, the carefully choreographed funeral designed to make it all look like a tragic accident of nature rather than what it was, a moment of rupture between a prince and the institution that tried to control him. And in the end, the empire he was meant to inherit didn't survive him by much. Within 3 decades, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy would collapse under the weight of war, nationalism, and its own ossified lies. The Habsburgs, like so many royal families, had been playing a game of myth-making for too long, and Mayerling was the card that snapped the whole deck in half. But while one empire was busy suffocating under the pressure of its own secrets, another was about to be unmasked in full daylight, with rumors of atrocities so monstrous, so supposedly exaggerated, that even international diplomats refused to believe them until they saw the bodies. 13. King Leopold II, Belgium. If you had walked into a Belgian school in the early 20th century and asked about King Leopold II, you'd have heard about grand architecture, urban reform, philanthropy, and the beautiful boulevards he carved through Brussels. The father of modern Belgium, they'd call him. A man of vision. A man who gave the nation parks, palaces, and respect on the international stage. What they probably wouldn't have told you, not then, and often not even now, is that the money behind all those shining facades was soaked in something far uglier than politics. The truth had already begun to whisper its way across Europe by the late 1800s, carried by missionaries, human rights workers, and reluctant diplomats. But for decades, it was treated as sensationalism, propaganda. Exaggerated, said the defenders. Impossible, said the elites. And yet, every word was true. Every number, if anything, was low. Because the most persistent rumor about King Leopold II was also the most damning. that his private colony in Central Africa, the Congo Free State, was not a philanthropic project, not a civilizing mission, but a privately owned horror show, run not by government decree, but by personal greed, corporate thuggery, and weaponized indifference. The Congo Free State was not technically part of Belgium. It belonged to Leopold personally, an imperial loophole dressed up as humanitarianism. In the late 19th century, as Europe carved up Africa like a dinner roast, Leopold convinced other powers that he would use his claim to the Congo Basin to bring Christianity, commerce, and civilization to the heart of the continent. He promised roads, schools, hospitals, progress, and then he set up a rubber empire. What followed was a decades-long campaign of extraction of land, labor, and lives, in which the local population was forced into rubber production under the threat of violence. Armed agents of the so-called force publique patrolled villages, demanding quotas and enforcing them through mutilation, hostage-taking, and collective punishment. It wasn't policy on paper, but it was policy in practice. Rubber or else. Reports trickled out, entire villages torched, families broken apart, punitive raids for low yields, severed limbs presented as proof that bullets hadn't been wasted. For years, these reports were treated as suspect, unreliable. After all, how could such a thing be happening in an age of modern empire building and Christian virtue? The royal palace in Brussels dismissed the claims as wild tales spread by British and American troublemakers. Leopold's PR machine swung into full gear. He hired ghostwriters. He funded press campaigns. He issued glowing reports about the progress in the Congo and the benevolence of his administration. And for a while it worked. Royal legacy, especially when framed in marble and stained glass, is hard to stain. But some rumors refuse to die quietly. Activists like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement brought receipts, literally. Casement's detailed 1904 report for the British Foreign Office, based on interviews and field investigations, laid bare the atrocities. Morel, once a shipping clerk, noticed a strange imbalance. Ships left Belgium for the Congo full of guns and returned full of rubber. No trade, no fairness, just raw extraction. The international outcry grew louder. Missionaries confirmed what newspapers couldn't ignore. First-hand accounts painted a picture not just of exploitation, but of industrialized brutality. Photos began to surface, horrifying, undeniable. It was no longer a question of rumor or bias. It was a question of how such a vast network of cruelty had been allowed to exist for so long, protected by royal prestige and polite disinterest. Eventually, the backlash reached critical mass. In 1908, after years of pressure, Leopold was forced to hand over the Congo Free State to the Belgian government. It was nationalized, rebranded, officially cleaned up, but the damage had already been done. Estimates vary, but historians agree that between 10 and 15 million Congolese died as a result of forced labor, famine, violence, and disease during Leopold's reign. Even if the higher estimates are contested, the scale is unignorable. The so-called rumor wasn't just true, it was worse than anyone had dared to imagine. Leopold died in 1909, bitter and unrepentant. When news of his death reached the streets of Belgium, people reportedly cheered. His funeral procession was met with hissing and silence. The man who had once been revered as a national builder was now seen, by many, though not all, as something else entirely. A monarch who had turned an entire region of the world into his personal cash register and justified it with marble plaques and stained glass windows. And yet, for years afterward, his legacy was still protected. Statues remained, boulevards bore his name, schools repeated the old myths. The slow correction of history took time and resistance. Even today, the full weight of his atrocities is still debated in Belgium. Some still defend his contributions as if public gardens and museums could balance the books. But history doesn't forget forever, And in the end, the Congo wasn't just a stain on Leopold's legacy. It was a mirror, one that revealed just how far a crown will go to deny its own reflection. Because sometimes the worst rumors aren't whispered in drawing rooms, they're printed on maps. And while Leopold hid cruelty behind architecture, another king was hiding something else entirely. A secret estate not made for ruling but for pleasure, and not the kind discussed in public. 14. Louis XV, France. At Versailles, everything glittered. Gold leaf, chandeliers, powdered wigs, fountains engineered to dance in perfect synchrony with classical music. The Sun King had long since set, but Louis XV, great-grandson of Louis XIV, still ruled in an orbit of opulence. To the outside world, his France shimmered with divine right authority, unmatched sophistication, and enough lace to smother a small army. But if Versailles was the public stage, then Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park, was the trapdoor beneath it. For decades there were whispers, not in the salons of Paris, where sycophancy thrived, but in the markets, the taverns, the theatres, the places where the monarchy was observed not as divinity, but as spectacle. The rumour went like this, that the king had a secret house within Versailles where young women were brought to entertain him, hidden from court, protected from scrutiny, and rotated like theatre props. Officially, there was nothing. No mention in the court circulars, no invitations, no receipts, just a name, Parc aux Cerfs. It sounded like slander, propaganda, the sort of fevered invention revolutionaries would cook up when they'd had one too many cups of cheap wine. The monarchy dismissed it all. Louis XV, they insisted, was no libertine. A melancholic, yes. A quiet man, perhaps, but not a predator. And yet, every year the rumours grew more vivid. Names began to circulate, ages, details. Most striking of all were the patterns. Young girls, often from modest families, would disappear into court life with little explanation and return, if at all, with expensive gifts, mysterious pensions, or new family connections. Some married well, others vanished from history altogether. For a long time there was plausible deniability. Kings have mistresses. This was understood, even expected. Madame de Pompadour had been Louis's official maîtresse en titre, and she was an institution unto herself. Intelligent, witty, politically savvy, she reigned over art and diplomacy like a minister in silk. But by the 1750s, her romantic relationship with the king had cooled. She remained powerful, but the physical part of their bond had ended, and that's when the rumours of the house intensified. Eventually, sources began to confirm what many had suspected all along. Parc aux Cerfs was real, not a hunting lodge, not a figment of political imagination, but an actual residence, discreetly managed, financially supported through shadow budgets, and stocked through intermediaries tasked with recruiting women deemed appropriate. Meaning young, pliable, and quiet. This wasn't about romance. This was systematized indulgence, hidden behind the ornamental facades of Versailles. Some girls were as young as 15. Some stayed for weeks, others longer. Many were given new names, coached in etiquette, and expected to maintain complete discretion. When they became inconvenient or simply dull, they were dismissed, often with a small dowry or a marriage arranged to buy their silence. What makes the scandal of Parc aux Cerfs so grotesque isn't just the secrecy, it's the denial of it, the way it was quietly institutionalized while the court maintained its icy elegance. Diplomats toasted under crystal chandeliers, while just a few steps away, the monarchy's moral compass spun like a weather vane in a storm. Louis XV was not a monster in the caricatured sense. He was shy, soft-spoken, prone to religious guilt, and often crushed by the pressures of kingship. But in the careful orchestration of a private world built around personal gratification, he became something far more dangerous, a ruler who mistook access for entitlement and secrecy for absolution. Even those who tried to speak out were drowned in protocol. The few who raised eyebrows were told not to confuse rumors with sedition. It wasn't until much later, decades after the king's death, that the truth was unambiguously confirmed. Royal accounts, letters, testimonies from those who had served in the house. The full shape of the deception became clear. This wasn't the indulgence of a man. It was a system designed to protect the man from the consequences of his indulgence. When Louis XV died in 1774, the people didn't mourn him. His cortege was jeered at along the route. Versailles, once the envy of Europe, had become a gilded farce, bloated, tone-deaf, and brittle. His successor, Louis XVI, would inherit the crown, but also the rot beneath it. Revolution was already rumbling. Parc aux Cerfs didn't cause the French Revolution, but it symbolized everything that made one inevitable. An institution more concerned with its own comfort than its people, a palace full of secrets, and a monarch who believed that what the public didn't see wouldn't hurt them, until of course it did. And while France tore down its palaces in a blaze of liberty, equality, and guillotines, a different kind of monarchy, quieter, far to the east, was undergoing its own royal drama. Not with heads on pikes or rumours of mistresses, but with a consort removed, reinstated and reshamed, all by official decree. 15. Thailand's royal consort drama. In the shadowed courtyards of Thailand's Grand Palace, where silence is policy and deference is law, even whispers can feel dangerous. The Thai monarchy, one of the oldest in the world, has long been shrouded in an intricate veil of sacred tradition, legal insulation, and absolute reverence. Its monarch is more than a head of state. He is a semi-divine figure, constitutionally protected from criticism, insulated from satire, and largely untouchable in both public opinion and criminal court. Which is what made the events of 2019 and 2020 so unprecedented, so baffling, and so undeniably real. For decades, the Thai monarchy avoided the tabloid-style implosions that plagued Europe's royals. While palace gossip existed, as it always does, it rarely escaped the inner circles. But that changed under King Maha Vajiralongkorn, also known as Rama X, whose reign has been anything but conventional. Even before ascending to the throne in 2016, Vajiralongkorn was a controversial figure. Known for his flamboyant lifestyle, multiple marriages and long stays in Germany, he was the subject of quiet unease, particularly in contrast to his father, the late King Bhumibol Adulyadej, who had ruled for 70 years and was widely revered. Vajiralongkorn, by contrast, seemed less like a modern monarch and more like a royal wildcard with diplomatic immunity. Then came the consort. In July 2019, in an official ceremony carried out with all the pomp of a constitutional thunderclap, the king named Sininat Wongvajirapakdi, a former army nurse and major general in the Royal Guard, as his Chao Kun Phra, or royal noble consort. The announcement was extraordinary for one reason. It was the first time in nearly a century that a Thai monarch had formally named a consort in addition to a queen. It was a throwback to ancient court tradition, a move so unexpected that even seasoned royal watchers weren't sure how to interpret it. Just months earlier, the king had married Suthida Tijai, a former flight attendant and bodyguard, making her queen. Now he was reviving a long-abandoned practice by naming a second woman to an official position within the palace hierarchy. But things didn't stay golden for long. 3 months later, in October 2019, the palace released a bombshell statement. Sininat had been stripped of all royal titles, decorations, and military ranks. The reason? Disloyalty. The official royal decree accused her of being ungrateful, of interfering with palace affairs, and of attempting to elevate herself to equal status with the queen. She had, according to the statement, violated the code of royal conduct and been unfaithful to the king in both word and deed. The statement wasn't vague. It was a publicly posted, state-approved denunciation, a royal character assassination broadcast to the entire country. Sini Nat disappeared from public life. Her photographs were removed from royal websites. Her
biography was deleted, and then silence. This is where, under normal circumstances, the story would end. A disgraced consort, gone without further explanation, replaced in memory by order. But Thailand, under Vajiralongkorn, has rewritten the rulebook on royal optics. In August 2020, less than a year after her very public fall from grace, the king stunned the country again. Sini Nat was reinstated, not just quietly forgiven, but fully, officially restored. Her titles, military ranks and decorations were returned in full, and the Royal Gazette proclaimed that she was not tarnished and had never done anything wrong. In other words, the previous statement, published with official authority, was to be unremembered. It was a royal reset, the kind only possible in systems where truth is what the throne says it is, and contradictions are explained with silence. Sini Nat reappeared soon after, joining the king and queen in carefully staged ceremonies and photo ops, smiling beneath layers of protocol. Her absence was never explained, her reinstatement never justified. In the eyes of the law, the previous scandal had not only vanished, it had never happened at all. But the public, despite the country's notoriously strict lèse-majesté laws, which criminalize criticism of the monarchy, was not entirely silent. Online, in coded language and satire-laced memes, people asked the obvious questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And how could both realities be true at once? The Thai monarchy offered no answers. It didn't need to. In a system where power flows from the throne outward, where every law, every calendar, every military rank is tethered to the will of the king, logic is optional. The consort drama was not just a scandal, it was a masterclass in narrative control, a public erasure followed by a royal undo button. What made the whole affair so fascinating wasn't just the drama, it was the institutional elasticity it revealed. The monarchy could destroy someone's reputation and then restore it without consequence. It didn't have to be consistent, it just had to be obeyed. But not every royal could count on a reset. Not every scandal was reversible. And in one of the world's most gilded city-states, another royal family would soon learn that even the deepest silences eventually answer back, especially when courtrooms start listening. 16. Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Dubai. In Dubai, appearances are everything. The skyline is a curated masterpiece of ambition, glass, steel, and spectacle built to dazzle the world into submission. On its surface, Dubai is the polished jewel of the Middle East, a city-state that sells modernity and moderation with the smooth confidence of a high-end real estate brochure. And at the top of it all stands Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President and Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates and ruler of Dubai. A poet, a billionaire, a racing enthusiast, a builder of islands shaped like continents. And for years, a man at the center of a whisper campaign that no one dared elevate to headlines, until the headlines arrived anyway. The rumors were not new. For well over a decade, there had been strange stories, murmurs in the international press, murmurs among human rights circles, about women in the Dubai royal family who had disappeared. The names were there, sometimes whispered, sometimes posted briefly before vanishing from online platforms. Sheikha Shamsa, Sheikha Latifa, daughters of Sheikh Mohammed, both reportedly silenced after attempting to flee the palace walls. Their faces circulated in human rights petitions and shadowy documentaries, but their fates were trapped in a fog of diplomatic denial. The Emirati government, for its part, dismissed these stories as falsehoods spread by malicious actors. When Sheikha Latifa attempted to escape by boat in 2018, in what would become a globally tracked Bond movie-level attempt at freedom, the official line was that she had been rescued and was now safe with her family. Photos were released of her with friends, with officials, in luxury settings. Her friends and allies insisted that the images were staged. The UN issued statements. Still, nothing moved. Sheikh Mohammed didn't blink. The Dubai machine kept humming. But then came a different kind of headline, one that couldn't be dismissed with Photoshop or silence. In 2020, the High Court of Justice in London, after a bitter and complex custody battle between Sheikh Mohammed and his former wife, Princess Haya bint al-Hussein, the half-sister of King Abdullah II of Jordan, issued a series of judgments that changed everything. Princess Haya had fled Dubai in 2019 with their 2 children and sought asylum in the UK. She claimed that she feared for her safety after discovering disturbing truths about what had happened to her husband's daughters, and that she herself had been intimidated and threatened. The British court, notoriously cautious about intervening in foreign affairs, conducted a deep investigation. The result? The court found that Sheikh Mohammed had orchestrated the abductions and forced returns of both Sheikha Shamsa and Sheikha Latifa, and had carried out an intense campaign of intimidation against Princess Haya. It wasn't just a legal ruling, it was confirmation of the rumours, of the fear, of the systemic control that had for years been brushed aside as hearsay. The judge stated in no uncertain terms that the sheikh had abused his power, used state resources to surveil and harass, and that his daughters were not merely missing, they had been detained against their will. In any other monarchy, that might have triggered a reckoning. In Dubai, the reaction was colder. The UAE government issued no apology. Sheikh Mohammed rejected the judgment's findings, claiming the British court had misunderstood cultural differences. But the damage was already done. The UK, the US, and international human rights organizations now had judicial confirmation of what had previously been dismissed as fiction. The implications were profound. Sheikh Mohammed wasn't just a monarch, he was a regular presence at global summits. He owned horse racing empires in the UK. He rubbed shoulders with royalty, captains of industry, and heads of state. And now a court had ruled that he had orchestrated the international kidnapping of his own children and weaponized his political machinery against his own wife. The story, despite its gravity, slipped back under the radar as fast as it had surfaced. Power, after all, has a short news cycle. Deals continued. Diplomatic ties were preserved, but the ruling remains on the books, a rare and damning rebuke from a foreign court against a reigning monarch. What makes this case different from most royal scandals is its officialness. The High Court's findings were not conjecture nor journalistic embellishment. They were judicial facts issued by a system known for its restraint. The story was no longer something whispered in activist circles. It was printed, signed, and filed in the legal record of a Western democracy. It's a case study in what happens when immense power collides with the boundaries of another legal system and loses. A royal figure, untouchable in his own country, found himself on the wrong end of transparency. But if this ruling gave anyone hope that unchecked royal corruption was finally running out of places to hide, that hope was short-lived. Because just across the desert, another monarchy was pulling off something even more staggering. A purge so vast, so choreographed and so lucrative that it made entire hotel lobbies feel like royal courtrooms. 17. The Saudi royals and the Ritz-Carlton purge. In most countries, when a head of state wants to crack down on corruption, they hold a press conference. Maybe they fire a few officials, pass some new laws, shake a few hands. In Saudi Arabia, they booked the Ritz-Carlton. It was November 2017 when the rumour, absurd, cinematic, too bold to be real, turned out to be the truth. Dozens of Saudi royals, ministers, billionaires and business moguls had been summoned to a meeting only to be quietly detained inside the five-star Ritz-Carlton hotel in Riyadh. For weeks, no one was quite sure what had happened. One day, the hotel was full of diplomats and brunch buffets. The next, its spa had become a holding facility for princes. The man behind the move was Mohammed bin Salman, the young crown prince who had been rapidly consolidating power under the guise of modernization. Known globally as MBS, he was charismatic, telegenic, and fluent in the language of reform. He promised to diversify the economy, empower women, curb religious extremism, and turn Saudi Arabia into something more digestible to the West. But at home, his tactics were far less subtle. The anti-corruption purge, as it was officially described, was said to be a moral crusade, a necessary cleanup of decades-long abuses of public funds, shady deals, and state-sanctioned theft. That part wasn't hard to believe. Saudi Arabia's elite had long been known for mixing private wealth with public authority, often with little distinction between personal assets and state resources. Still, the methods raised eyebrows. Over 300 individuals were detained. The Ritz-Carlton was transformed into a gilded holding pen, complete with private security, frozen bank accounts, and whispered interrogations. High-profile names like Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, one of the world's richest men, were among those rounded up. Some were released within days. Others stayed for weeks, a few months. A handful reportedly never left at all. The Saudi government insisted that it was not detention, merely questioning. But the walls didn't open. Phones were confiscated. Lawyers were not seen. Families were given minimal updates, and as the days stretched into weeks, it became clear this was not just a cleanup, it was a power move. Critics called it a palace coup dressed up as a moral campaign. MBS, newly elevated as heir apparent, had removed his biggest rivals from public life in one dazzling efficient swoop without ever firing a shot. There were no public trials, no televised hearings. Instead, the detained were offered a simple deal: pay back what you took or what the state says you took, and you can go home. The numbers were staggering. The Saudi government later claimed that the purge recovered over $100 billion in settlements. Real estate, cash, stocks, assets, all quietly transferred back into state control. But the lack of transparency meant no one really knew how the amounts were calculated or who exactly had been coerced into compliance. It was, in effect, a mass financial negotiation conducted in private, under lock and chandelier. The public reaction inside Saudi Arabia was cautiously supportive. After all, ordinary citizens had watched for decades as royals flaunted wealth on a galactic scale. Fleets of cars, gold-plated jets, palaces stocked like museums. The idea that someone finally was holding the elite accountable had a certain populist appeal, and MBS, with his modern suits and economic slogans, styled himself as the man cleaning house. But outside observers were less convinced. Human rights groups questioned the legality of the detentions. Economists worried about the precedent, that business deals in Saudi Arabia now came with a side order of political risk. Investors asked an awkward question: if the state can detain a billionaire over brunch, what's to stop them from coming for anyone else? The Ritz-Carlton reopened in February 2018. The chandeliers were dusted, the breakfast buffet returned, guests checked in again, perhaps unaware that their suite had once held a prince under financial siege. The entire episode was wiped from the surface, but not from memory. The purge achieved its immediate goal. MBS emerged with fewer rivals, a bolstered treasury, and global headlines that used words like bold and decisive. But the deeper implications were harder to pin down. Was it justice, reform, extortion? A silent shakedown with velvet curtains. What made the scandal so unusual was its legality. It was never technically illegal. There were no public charges, no court rulings, no trials, just royal authority applied with absolute discretion. And that perhaps was the most revealing part. In a monarchy built on divine rule and executive opacity, due process is not a requirement. It's an optional flourish. And while Saudi Arabia rebranded itself with PR campaigns and foreign investments, one of its neighbours, tiny, oil-rich and equally opaque, was facing a scandal that didn't begin in a hotel or a courtroom, but in the boardrooms of London, New York and Geneva. A prince from Brunei was about to remind the world that royal excess isn't always about thrones. Sometimes it's about the receipts. 18. Prince Jeffrey of Brunei. There are scandals, and then there are spreadsheets. If Saudi Arabia's Ritz-Carlton purge was about political survival dressed in palace drama, the saga of Prince Jeffrey Bolkiah of Brunei was something else entirely. A decade-spanning symphony of decadence, litigation, and luxury that turned one royal prince into a punchline, a case study, and eventually a cautionary tale about what happens when nobody says no for 30 years straight. Brunei isn't often in the headlines. The oil-rich Southeast Asian Sultanate is small, quiet, and tightly controlled by its ruling family, the Bolkiahs, headed by Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah, one of the world's wealthiest monarchs. For years, the country's staggering oil revenue allowed it to function almost like a financial mirage. Free healthcare, no income tax, a welfare system funded by hydrocarbon wealth, and a public that rarely questioned the royal family's expenditures. But inside that quiet little kingdom was Prince Jeffrey, the Sultan's younger brother, who somehow made even Brunei's wealth look modest. The rumours started small. He had a taste for luxury. He liked cars. He liked real estate. He liked throwing parties in hotels he sometimes owned. But by the late 1990s, those rumours had ballooned into something else entirely. Into allegations of massive financial mismanagement, shady asset transfers, and personal spending so extravagant it felt like satire. At the heart of the scandal was the Brunei Investment Agency, BIA, the Sultanate's sovereign wealth fund. Prince Jeffrey had been given stewardship over it in the 1980s. Ostensibly, his role was to manage the state's global investments, to be the businessman of the royal family, growing the nation's wealth through shrewd financial dealings. Instead, what followed was a spending spree so vast, so surreal, that even investigators struggled to describe it with a straight face. Estimates suggest that Jeffrey spent over $14 billion during his tenure at the BIA, not on infrastructure, not on economic diversification, but on private jets, dozens of luxury cars, international properties, jewelry, art, yachts, and a revolving cast of personal staff and consultants. His empire stretched across continents. He purchased the New York Palace Hotel and the Plaza Athénée in Paris, maintained a yacht named Tits, with tenders named Nipple 1 and Nipple 2, and commissioned a series of custom statues of himself in, let's say, heroic poses. It wasn't just excessive, it was cartoonish. But for years, nothing happened. After all, this was Brunei. The royal family answered to no one, and Jeffrey's antics were seen, at worst, as embarrassing but private. The international press caught wind of some of it, but the monarchy's image remained intact, protected by oil money and diplomatic distance. That changed in 1998. Amid the Asian financial crisis and mounting internal pressure, Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah launched an investigation into the state of the BIA's finances. What they found confirmed the rumours, and then some. Billions were unaccounted for. Assets were missing or frozen in private trusts, and Prince Jeffrey, it turned out, had been treating the fund like his personal piggy bank for over a decade. Legal action followed, but it was less courtroom drama and more chess match. The Sultan sued his brother in British courts, and in 2000, Jeffrey signed a confidential settlement agreement. Under the terms, he was required to return many of the misappropriated assets, including dozens of properties, vehicles, and other holdings. But within a few years, Jeffrey claimed the agreement had been violated and launched his own legal offensive. What followed was a parade of lawsuits across multiple jurisdictions: London, New York, Geneva, Brunei.
At one point, the British court described Geoffrey's behaviour as extraordinary and defiant, as he continued to challenge rulings and resist asset seizures. The court even ordered the seizure of his lavish London mansion, which had once been the object of a private party so extravagant it involved importing tropical birds. In 2010, a UK court ruled against him again, reaffirming that he had to surrender the assets in question. But enforcing that order proved difficult. The global sprawl of Geoffrey's holdings made untangling the money trail nearly impossible. Lawyers struggled to track ownership structures cloaked in shell companies and trusts. Private investigators were dispatched. Bank accounts disappeared overnight. Meanwhile, Geoffrey continued to live, if not as extravagantly as before, then certainly not modestly. The lawsuits became quieter but never entirely vanished. His name was synonymous with unchecked royal excess, the kind that made even Gulf monarchies look minimalist. What made the scandal so enduring wasn't just the size of the alleged theft, it was the fact that it had happened so transparently for so long, under the watch of a regime that claimed to be clean, moral, and efficient. Prince Geoffrey hadn't just pushed at the boundaries of royal privilege, he'd replaced them with velvet ropes and valet parking. And if Brunei wanted to bury the story, the West wouldn't let them. Courts kept the documents public. Investigative journalists kept the paper trails alive, and international lawyers ensured that Prince Geoffrey's name would become synonymous not just with greed, but with the long, slow collapse of the illusion that royalty means responsibility. But while Geoffrey's scandal was global in reach, the next royal disaster unfolded in one of the world's smallest countries, where tradition, patriarchy, and opulence combined into a monarchy that wasn't just wasteful, it was shameless about it. 19. King Mswati III, Eswatini. In a world where monarchies have mostly been reduced to ribbon cutting and ceremonial waving, King Mswati III of Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, has held on to the old model: one-man rule, absolute authority, and a royal household that operates more like a closed corporation than a constitutional figurehead. While his country remains among the poorest in the world, the king has for decades lived in a parallel universe, one that makes Versailles look thrifty by comparison. The rumours started decades ago, quietly at first. Allegations of extravagance, unchecked spending, and royal entitlement that veered into the surreal. At first, they were easy to dismiss as jealousy, anti-monarchist exaggeration, or the usual post-colonial grumbling. But slowly, through reports, satellite photos, leaked documents, and the occasional reluctant government admission, the picture became undeniable. The king of Eswatini was living like an oil sheik, while the majority of his citizens lived on less than $2 a day. The stories were almost too absurd to take seriously, until they kept proving to be true. There were the fleet of luxury cars, including dozens of high-end Mercedes-Benz models, BMWs and Rolls-Royces. Not one or two, dozens. At one point, photos leaked showing a $500,000 Maybach being unloaded at the royal palace, casually covered in a tarp like it was lawn furniture. Then came the reports of a private jet, reportedly purchased for the king with public funds, under the pretense of state business travel. A government spokesman once tried to spin this as a cost-saving measure. The math did not survive scrutiny. Meanwhile, in the towns and rural villages that make up most of Eswatini's population, basic infrastructure remained skeletal. Schools were overcrowded, hospitals were underfunded, youth unemployment hovered near 50%. The contrast between the king's lifestyle and the national standard of living wasn't just jarring, it was biblical in scale. An entire country grinding through economic hardship while their ruler built palatial compounds and planned lavish birthday celebrations. The king, for his part, rarely addressed the allegations directly. When he did, his responses were more philosophical than practical. He spoke about tradition, culture, and divine right, the usual rhetorical insulation of absolute monarchs. Eswatini, after all, is one of the few remaining countries where the king holds actual executive power. Parliament exists, but largely at his pleasure. Elections are held, but political parties are banned from contesting them. Critics have a short shelf life, and yet the criticism kept coming from civil society groups, from international watchdogs, and increasingly from Swazis themselves, many of whom began to question why their king needed 15 wives, multiple palaces, and international shopping sprees when the country couldn't guarantee electricity to its rural clinics. The
Government strategy, when confronted with these questions, was twofold: deflect and repress. Protests were often broken up by force. Journalists were intimidated. Public criticism of the monarchy could lead to sudden career changes, or worse. In 2021, widespread unrest broke out across the country, driven by anger over inequality, lack of political reform, and the king's extravagance. The response was swift and violent. Reports of deaths, disappearances, and midnight arrests trickled out, difficult to verify but consistent in tone. Still, the monarchy tried to maintain a public image. Carefully managed royal celebrations were broadcast on national TV. Cultural events emphasized unity. Dancers in traditional garb paraded in front of cameras, while armored vehicles quietly idled outside the frame. But the world was watching. International human rights organizations began to raise concerns not just about civil liberties, but about the allocation of national resources. In 2020, a report from Amnesty International highlighted systemic issues of state corruption and economic mismanagement, with a pointed focus on royal expenditures. Even the United Nations began urging transparency and reform. It didn't help that the numbers were so blunt. According to leaked financial summaries and media investigations, royal spending in some years exceeded the combined budgets for health and education. That's not just embarrassing, that's an economic indictment, especially when paired with the king's personal investments abroad, including real estate portfolios and overseas bank accounts. Supporters of the king argued that his lifestyle was part of Swazi tradition, that his role as a cultural figurehead justified the pageantry. But critics pointed out the contradiction. If the monarchy is a sacred cultural institution, why does it need a fleet of sports cars and regular shopping trips to Paris? In the end, the real scandal wasn't just the spending, it was the indifference. The sense that nothing, no amount of poverty, no level of protest, no international condemnation could penetrate the walls of the royal compound. That while the king danced in public ceremonies and recited ancestral blessings, his people were still lining up for water. And so, what began as rumour, the kind of rumour you laugh off at first, became a grotesque kind of state policy. Royal luxury as default, national hardship as background noise. And while Eswatini's palace defended it all in the name of culture, another monarchy half a continent away was facing the opposite problem. A culture so rattled by a royal scandal, it rewrote its own constitution just to stop it from happening again. 20. Malaysia's royal violence scandal. In Malaysia, the royal families are not symbolic figureheads locked behind palatial gates. They're active participants in the country's unique political architecture. 9 royal houses that rotate the national kingship every 5 years. It's monarchy by committee, tradition spliced with constitutional ritual. But in the 1990s, that dignified choreography was violently disrupted by a scandal so blunt, so embarrassing, and so undeniable that it triggered the one thing no monarch expects: a change in the law. The whispers had started long before, that some royal households, particularly the powerful Sultanate of Johor, had long enjoyed impunity, that their members, guarded by prestige and inherited titles, could act outside the normal bounds of law. Stories of altercations, threats, and assaults circulated quietly, but these were Malaysia's sultans. To accuse them publicly was not only culturally taboo, but legally dangerous.
For most people, it wasn't worth the risk. That changed in 1992 when a scandal broke into the public consciousness, not through rumor or backroom gossip, but via a locker room. The victim was Douglas Gomez, a hockey coach who had dared to criticize the management of Johore's state hockey team. He had written a letter, not a protest, not a rally, just a formal critique, and for that he was summoned to the palace. And according to reports later corroborated by multiple sources, assaulted by Sultan Iskandar of Johore himself. The details, scrubbed in public retellings, but well documented in court testimonies and news reports, made the act impossible to ignore. This wasn't a minor scuffle or a tabloid misunderstanding. It was an explicit abuse of power by a reigning sultan against a civilian. And more critically, it wasn't the first time. As journalists began to investigate the incident, they uncovered a troubling pattern. Sultan Iskandar, who had once served as Malaysia's Yang di Pertuan Agong, or national king from 1984 to 1989, had a history of similar allegations. The list included altercations with subordinates, rumors of retribution against officials, and an air of entitlement so thick it could no longer be disguised as royal decorum. What made this different, however, was the national mood. Malaysia in the 1990s was not the same place it had been in earlier decades. The press, though still cautious, had become bolder. Parliament was less inclined to defer automatically to palace authority, and Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, already engaged in a long project to modernize Malaysia's institutions, saw an opportunity and took it. The assault on Gomez triggered a parliamentary firestorm. Opposition parties, journalists, and even members of the royal-friendly establishment called for accountability. The government launched an inquiry. The Sultan, through his palace representatives, tried to minimize the incident, but the public was no longer willing to accept royal immunity as a defense. What followed was an unprecedented political showdown. A constitutional reform movement aimed at stripping the Malay rulers of their legal invincibility. Before the scandal, Malaysia's sultans were legally untouchable, immune from prosecution, civil or criminal. The idea was rooted in centuries of tradition and codified in the country's post-independence constitution. But now, with public opinion firmly in favor of reform, Mahathir's government proposed a radical solution, a special court that could try reigning sultans for criminal acts or civil claims. The idea was met with immediate resistance from the royal houses. Statements were issued, meetings were held, there were quiet threats of crisis, but the government didn't blink. By 1993, the constitutional amendments were passed with overwhelming parliamentary support. The law now allowed rulers to be sued or prosecuted, provided the case passed through the special court mechanism. It was a watershed moment, not just for Malaysia, but for constitutional monarchy as a global institution. For the first time, a country had publicly and legally revoked royal immunity in response to a violent incident, and the monarchy survived. The palace wasn't burned, the flag wasn't changed, but the rules were. The monarchy remained intact, diminished in stature perhaps, but not overthrown. Sultan Iskandar stayed on the throne of Johore until his death in 2010, but his reputation never fully recovered. The Gomez case followed him for the rest of his reign. It became a kind of national shorthand for what happens when power goes unchecked. What makes the scandal so enduring isn't just the incident itself, it's the reaction. For decades, the royals of Malaysia had lived in a bubble of legal immunity, a protective shell that allowed privilege to slide into impunity. But one slap, delivered in anger, received in silence, shattered it. And what emerged was something rare. A nation willing to say out loud that no one is above the law. But while Malaysia rewrote its constitution in pursuit of justice, a very different monarchy, surrounded not by marble palaces but by volcanic islands, was quietly writing itself into scandal, one license at a time. The corruption didn't arrive by violence or inheritance. It arrived by paperwork in the form of lucrative opium licenses, political bribes, and a kingdom that was slowly slipping away. 21. King Kalakaua and Hawaii's opium license scandal. In the lush, swaying tropics of the late 19th century Hawaiian kingdom, King David Kalakaua was many things: a modernizer, a poet, a diplomat, and a lover of electric lights and elaborate pageantry. He brought hula back into public life. He traveled the world on a goodwill tour decades before that became standard monarch behavior. He promoted science and culture and hosted the first telephone call in Hawaii. But behind the lees and the speeches, there was a rumor, one that clung to his reign like salt air on stone, that the king, beloved as he was in some quarters, had personally profited from the illegal licensing of opium. For decades, it sounded like nothing more than old political slander. Kalakaua was not short on enemies, especially among the haole, foreign business elite, who were already maneuvering for power. And corruption was the easiest smear to deploy in the volatile climate of colonial ambition. But this wasn't just gossip whispered by plantation barons or muttered in missionary salons. It was a persistent accusation with names, dates, and trails of money that led straight to the palace doors. The story begins in the 1880s, when Hawaii's government was caught in the crosswinds of modernizing reform, foreign interference, and internal dissent. The monarchy was still legally in charge, but economically and politically, the American and European business class had begun asserting its influence. The islands, once a sovereign Polynesian kingdom, were being pulled inch by inch toward annexation. And Kalakaua, ambitious and increasingly isolated, was in need of money. He had invested heavily in royal projects, grand building initiatives, world tours, national holidays, all of which drained the treasury. He had big dreams, yes, but a shrinking budget. Enter the opium license. Opium at the time was both a legal and highly profitable trade in Hawaii, especially among Chinese immigrant laborers who worked the plantations. The government regulated its distribution through a licensing system. One license, just one, was awarded at a time, essentially granting monopoly control over the drug sale. This made the license a gold mine. Whoever held it could name their price, and the competition for it was fierce. In 1886, the license was awarded to a Chinese businessman named Aki, not unusual on its face, except that Aki soon claimed he had paid $75,000 directly to King Kalakaua to secure the license. When the license was later revoked and given to someone else, Aki didn't take the loss quietly. He sued. The case became public. And suddenly, the allegation wasn't just rumor, it was testimony. Aki insisted that the payment was a bribe delivered personally to palace intermediaries with the understanding that he would receive the opium concession in return. When he didn't, he went to court. The government denied everything, of course. The palace framed it as a case of sour grapes, a sore loser trying to undermine royal credibility. But the damage was done. Whether or not Aki's exact claims were provable, the broader perception was now toxic. Kalakaua's enemies seized the opportunity. The scandal was used as fuel in the growing campaign to limit the monarchy's power. The foreign business class, led by white planters and lawyers, began openly calling for constitutional reform, not just to fix the corruption, they said, but to protect Hawaii from its own king. By 1887, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Armed militias, largely composed of Americans and Europeans, forced Kalakaua to sign what became known as the Bayonet Constitution, so named because it was signed under duress. The new constitution drastically reduced the monarch's authority, disenfranchised most native Hawaiians, and handed control of the government to the legislature, which was now dominated by white settlers. In essence, the scandal had been weaponized into a political coup. The opium license was the excuse, but the goal had always been deeper, to break the monarchy's spine and pave the way for annexation. Kalakaua remained king in name, but lost much of his power. His health declined. His spirit, by many accounts, never recovered. He died in 1891 during a trip to San Francisco, reportedly while trying to secure new diplomatic support for Hawaii's independence. His sister, Queen Liliuokalani, succeeded him, but by then the writing was on the palace wall. Within a few years, the monarchy would be overthrown entirely. The Republic of Hawaii was declared in 1894. The US annexed the islands in 1898, and what had once been a sovereign kingdom was reduced to a territory, and eventually a state. Was the opium license scandal the sole cause of the fall? Of course not, but it was the turning point, the moment when the king's financial desperation collided with political opportunism and external ambition. A single license, handed out behind closed doors, had cracked open the legitimacy of the crown. And while Hawaii was being swallowed by foreign powers, another small European nation, far from the tropics and much colder in tone, was about to face its own royal exorcism. One that involved seances, mystics, and a queen so besotted by a so-called healer that the government nearly collapsed just to get rid of her.
22. Queen Juliana and the Faith Healer Crisis. In the history of royal scandals, some involve mistresses, others money, still others missing heirs, shadowy deals, or unfortunate microphones. But in the Netherlands in the 1950s, the greatest threat to the Dutch monarchy wasn't treason, corruption, or tabloid disgrace. It was a woman named Greet Hofmans, a self-styled spiritual healer with a passion for the paranormal and an uncanny ability to get inside the mind of a queen. To understand how it all spiraled out of control, you first have to understand Queen Juliana, soft-spoken, empathetic, progressive, and by royal standards, profoundly human. She was the daughter of Queen Wilhelmina and became monarch in 1948, at a time when the Netherlands was still recovering from the traumas of Nazi occupation. Where her predecessors were regal and distant, Juliana made it her mission to be approachable. She wore simple clothes, rode bicycles, and visited ordinary citizens without entourage or ceremony. She believed in democracy. She believed in equality. And, most critically for this story, she believed in healing. By the early 1950s, Queen Juliana was struggling with a personal crisis. Her youngest daughter, Princess Marika, later known as Princess Christina, had been born nearly blind due to rubella during pregnancy. It devastated the Queen. The royal doctors offered little hope, and so Juliana, desperate for alternatives, turned to the unconventional. Enter Greet Hofmans, a nurse-turned-spiritual advisor with no formal medical training. Hofmans presented herself as a kind of clairvoyant healer, blending mysticism, faith healing, and pacifist ideology into a highly persuasive personal philosophy. She was charismatic, soft-spoken, and most importantly, offered Juliana hope. What began as quiet consultations quickly became something more serious. Hofmans moved into Soestdijk Palace. She wasn't a guest, she was a presence, advising, comforting, and slowly becoming part of the Queen's daily rhythm. The court was alarmed. Royal advisors watched as Hofmans grew closer to the Queen, reportedly influencing not only her thoughts about her daughter's health, but her political views as well. Juliana became increasingly pacifist, increasingly skeptical of the military, and increasingly suspicious of the traditional advisory class. The monarchy, long positioned as a neutral symbol of unity, now seemed like it was drifting into ideological territory, guided not by seasoned ministers or constitutional law, but by a mystic in a cardigan. The Queen's husband, Prince Bernhard, yes, the same Bernhard later implicated in the Lockheed bribery scandal, was furious. He reportedly saw Hofmans as a manipulator, a fraud, and a political liability.
The couple's relationship, already strained, grew openly hostile. Bernhard wanted Hoffmanns gone. Juliana refused. For years, this power struggle played out behind palace walls, out of view. But palace walls are not as thick as they used to be. Rumors began to leak, first in political circles, then in the press, then finally in an explosive 1956 article in Der Spiegel, which laid bare the extent of Hoffmann's influence. The article detailed an inner court divided by spiritualism and suspicion, with Juliana increasingly isolated and the government inching toward full-blown constitutional crisis. The Dutch public was stunned. Their soft-spoken, bicycle-riding queen, a woman many viewed as morally unimpeachable, was now at the center of what some were calling a quasi-cult scandal. The cabinet was reportedly on the verge of resignation. There was even talk, briefly and behind closed doors, of forced abdication. The monarchy had to act, but delicately. This was not a case of criminality or misconduct. It was belief, conviction, emotion. To remove Hoffmanns would risk further isolating the Queen. To do nothing would risk losing the confidence of the government. A compromise was struck. Hoffmanns was quietly expelled from the court. No public statement, no trial, no ceremony, just gone. Juliana, devastated, reportedly wept, but the damage had been contained, just barely. The Prime Minister stayed, the cabinet remained, the Queen kept her throne, and the official version of events was slowly papered over in the dull beige of palace protocol. Years later, the monarchy would refer to it as a period of tension. That's one way to put it. Another way is this: the Dutch monarchy came within inches of collapsing because its queen placed her faith in a woman who promised comfort over consensus, healing over policy, and conviction over restraint. In the aftermath, Juliana became more cautious. The royal household tightened. The monarchy refocused on tradition, but the crisis left a permanent watermark on the institution. Not because Hoffmanns turned out to be malevolent, she didn't, but because the entire episode revealed just how vulnerable a royal house can become when private belief collides with public responsibility. And while Hoffmanns was ushered out with soft silence, another European court would soon attempt something more severe, to suppress not just influence but identity, to erase a scandal with hush money, silence a man who knew too much, and bury the truth beneath decades of plausible deniability. 23. King Gustav V and the Hijby affair. Sweden likes to think of itself as above scandal, polite, progressive, egalitarian, a land of consensus politics and neutral diplomacy. Even its monarchy tends to feel more IKEA than Versailles, restrained, symbolic, modest in tone. But in the mid-20th century, the Swedish royal family found itself entangled in a secret so delicate, so carefully buried, that it would take over 40 years for the full truth to emerge. And even then, it came wrapped in redactions, retractions, and official discomfort. At the center of the storm was King Gustav V, who reigned from 1907 to 1950, a monarch who saw 2 world wars, survived multiple political crises, and was generally regarded as a quiet, disciplined figurehead. But behind the dignified exterior was a rumor so radioactive that Swedish newspapers wouldn't touch it for decades, that the king had a deeply personal relationship with a man named Kurt Hijby, and that this relationship had been suppressed by the Swedish state with payments, censorship, and covert imprisonment. For years, the whispers floated quietly through Stockholm, in bars, salons, and backstage dressing rooms. Hijby, a former waiter and minor criminal turned aspiring playwright, had apparently had a private relationship with the king. The nature of the relationship was left deliberately vague. Was it emotional, romantic, manipulative? That was part of the fog. What was undeniable, however, was that the Swedish establishment, determined to protect the monarchy's image, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep Hijby quiet. The story begins in the 1930s, when Hijby allegedly began blackmailing the royal court.
The details remain murky, but according to later court records and memoirs, Hijeby claimed to have had a personal and possibly intimate connection with King Gustav V that had begun in the 1910s or 1920s. Whether the king reciprocated or was manipulated is a matter still debated by historians, but what is certain is this: the palace paid him off, repeatedly. Over the span of roughly 2 decades, Hijeby received hundreds of thousands of kroner in various forms: direct payments, business loans, and undisclosed settlements. These payouts came not from the king's personal account, but through channels tied to the royal court and later the Ministry of Justice. The payments were not just hush money, they were state-sponsored silence. In 1938, when Hijeby published a fictionalized novel alluding to the relationship, authorities acted swiftly. The book was confiscated. The few copies that had been printed were destroyed. Hijeby was arrested, then confined to a psychiatric hospital without formal charges. Later, he was exiled to Germany, yes, Nazi Germany, with quiet help from Swedish officials eager to get him out of the country. He returned to Sweden after the war, but the harassment didn't stop. In 1952, he was arrested again, this time tried, and convicted for attempted blackmail. The trial was closed to the public. Key records were sealed. The press was given only vague, sanitized summaries of the proceedings. Hijeby served time in prison. By then, King Gustav V had died, and his successor, Gustav VI Adolf, inherited not only the crown, but a palace still grappling with the skeletons in its locked drawers. For decades, the Hijeby affair remained the stuff of urban legend, occasionally mentioned, never confirmed. Sweden's deferential press played along. The few journalists who poked at the story were warned off, subtly or otherwise, and the official narrative that Hijeby was a con artist and extortionist was left untouched. Then, in the 1990s, with the liberalization of archives and the fading of royal taboos, the story re-emerged. Declassified documents revealed the extent of the state's involvement, the financial records, the psychiatric commitment, the secret trials, the censorship. What had once been a rumor was now documented reality. The Swedish government had, for decades, orchestrated a cover-up, not necessarily to protect a crime, but to protect a narrative. What's unsettling is how routine the suppression had become. No dramatic showdowns, no public outcry, just quiet, bureaucratic complicity. Ministers signing off on payouts, judges approving gag orders, police following unofficial instructions. The affair wasn't so much hidden as it was treated like a file, too awkward to open. And Hijeby, he died in 1965, largely discredited, still claiming he'd been used and discarded by a system that valued royal dignity over human fairness. Whether he was a victim, a manipulator, or something in between, the truth is that the state didn't bother to find out. It just wanted him to disappear. The Hijeby affair didn't end the Swedish monarchy, but it punctured something more subtle: the illusion that clean monarchies, those with democratic facades and progressive branding, were immune to the same moral evasions as their flashier cousins. In protecting the crown, the state had erased the man, and in doing so, it confirmed the one thing it had spent half a century denying, that the rumor was real. But just as Sweden tried to manage its scandal with legal sleight of hand, another royal house, drenched in glamour, basking in Mediterranean sun, would soon face a similar issue. Only this time, the prince wouldn't deny his private life. He would confirm it in public, twice. 24. Prince Albert of Monaco. First segment acknowledging children born out of wedlock. The Principality of Monaco is only 2 square kilometers of sun-soaked glamour, but for decades it has operated like a Mediterranean fairy tale, one where scandal hides under silk and the line between myth and PR is as thin as a red carpet. The Grimaldi dynasty has always known how to play that line. Ever since Grace Kelly married Prince Rainier III and turned a postage stamp-sized country into the Riviera's answer to Hollywood, Monaco has built itself on the illusion of perfect beauty and curated lineage. So when Prince Albert II, son of Grace and Rainier, reigning monarch since 2005, began facing rumours of illegitimate children, the palace followed the old playbook: polite denials, carefully worded statements, and a firm expectation that the media would eventually move on. Except this time, it didn't. For years, tabloid whispers followed Albert wherever he went. There were vague claims of paternity, hushed settlements, and stories that someone somewhere was raising a child with Grimaldi DNA but without royal recognition. The official response was always the same: no comment, nothing proven, move along. But in 2005, just days before his official enthronement as sovereign prince, the silence broke. In a statement issued by the palace, Albert publicly acknowledged that he was the biological father of a young boy named Alexandre Grimaldi Coste, born in 2003 to Nicole Coste, a former Air France flight attendant from Togo. The acknowledgement came not from public pressure, but from legal necessity. Coste had filed a paternity suit, and DNA testing confirmed Albert's parentage. The press didn't have to speculate anymore. The rumour was real. The palace tried to present it as a private matter, handled with dignity. But it was a rupture in the Grimaldi image. Monaco was a monarchy obsessed with succession, lineage, and protocol. And now, its soon-to-be sovereign was stepping into power with a paternity suit freshly stamped by the court. But the story didn't end there. In 2006, just 1 year later, Albert issued a second bombshell. He was also the father of a young girl named Jasmine Grace Grimaldi, born in California in 1992. Her mother, Tamara Rotolo, had filed a paternity suit more than a decade earlier. This time, there had been little media heat and even less public interest. But Albert, now reigning prince, voluntarily acknowledged the child as his own, confirming a second long-standing rumour that had quietly floated beneath the tabloid surface. Both children were born out of wedlock. Neither was eligible for the monegasque throne under the country's succession laws. But in publicly recognising them, Albert upended years of speculation and forced Monaco to confront something it had avoided for decades: that even in the palace built on perfection, real life happens. To be clear, Albert did not commit a crime. He didn't try to cover up the births in the extreme ways seen in other royal scandals. There were no hush payments, at least none publicly known, no forged documents, no denials dragged out over decades. But the fact that these rumours had existed at all and had been true was enough to poke a hole in Monaco's porcelain facade. And behind that, something more revealing: the monarchy's obsession with image. For a country whose economy depends in part on its reputation as a playground for the world's ultra-wealthy, maintaining a spotless royal front isn't just tradition, it's marketing. Albert's decision to acknowledge the children came with tightly controlled messaging. The palace emphasized that he was assuming his responsibilities and that the children would be provided for, but they would not carry titles. They would not be part of the royal line. They were acknowledged and simultaneously disqualified. And yet, the act of admission changed something. The public saw not just a prince but a man, someone who, like most people, had a past that didn't fit neatly into the palace brochure, and strangely, it didn't destroy him. Monaco didn't fall, the casinos stayed open, the yachts kept docking, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The announcements came just as Albert was ascending the throne, as if the monarchy had decided better to clean house in daylight than risk blackmail in the dark. And in the years since, Prince Albert has remained close with both of his acknowledged children, occasionally appearing with them in public. Jasmine has become something of a media personality. Alexandra, now older, lives between Europe and Africa. Neither holds royal titles, but both have been integrated carefully, quietly, into the fringes of royal life. Still, the damage was done to Monaco's myth.
The perfect prince, raised by a Hollywood queen and destined to reign over the most photogenic strip of land in Europe, turned out to be, well, normal, which in royal terms is sometimes the greatest scandal of all. But if Monaco's transgressions were defined by quiet acknowledgements and well-timed press releases, the next case would unfold very differently. It would feature criminal trials, public humiliation, and the kind of institutional decay that no palace memo could spin into dignity. Because in Spain, the royal family's troubles weren't whispered behind palace gates, they were shouted from courtroom steps. 25. The Spanish crown and the corruption spiral. If the Spanish monarchy had a motto in the early 2000s, it might have been something like, "Just don't look too closely." The country was still basking in the post-Franco glow of democratic rebirth. The royal family, led by King Juan Carlos I, had been hailed for helping steer Spain into the modern era. The monarchy was admired, even loved. It was, for a brief moment, one of Europe's few untarnished crowns. And then the cracks started to show. The first major rupture came through Iñaki Urdangarin, the Duke of Palma, a former Olympic handball player married to Infanta Cristina, the king's second daughter. Tall, handsome, and thoroughly telegenic, Urdangarin was embraced by the royal family as a modern prince for a modern Spain. He took on charitable roles, public-facing foundations, and quickly built a reputation as a philanthropist and businessman. But behind the scenes, something else was happening, something painfully ordinary. He was embezzling money, lots of it. Through the News Institute, a supposedly non-profit foundation Urdangarin co-managed, he funneled millions in public funds for sporting and cultural events that either never happened or were vastly overpriced. The money came from regional governments, especially the Balearic Islands and Valencia, and was laundered through a network of shell companies and private accounts. And this wasn't just a footnote in royal bookkeeping, this was front-page material. By the early 2010s, the allegations were in full swing. Spain was deep in economic crisis, and austerity measures were hammering ordinary citizens. Unemployment was soaring, public trust in institutions was tanking, and now, it turned out, the king's son-in-law had been billing taxpayers for fake events while the country sank into recession. The scandal was no longer containable. In 2014, Urdangarin was formally charged, and for the first time in modern Spanish history, a member of the royal family stood trial in open court. Infanta Cristina was also implicated, not charged with fraud, but accused of profiting from the scheme and turning a blind eye. The trial was a slow-motion disaster for the monarchy. Royal emails were read in court, financial records were displayed, old photographs were reinterpreted through the lens of public betrayal. In 2017, Urdangarin was convicted and sentenced to prison. Infanta Cristina was acquitted of criminal wrongdoing, but the court made it clear she had benefited from the crime. The royal family distanced themselves, quietly but definitively. The couple lost their titles, the palace cut them out of official functions, and King Juan Carlos, by then already diminished, stepped down in 2014 in favour of his son, Felipe VI, who was left to pick up the broken porcelain pieces of the once pristine crown. What made the scandal so corrosive wasn't just the crime, it was the symbolism. Spain's royal family had been pitched as guardians of democracy, morally above the fray. And now they were in it, deeply, publicly and legally, and this wasn't even the end. Urdangarin's scandal was just the first avalanche. More would follow. Accusations about Juan Carlos's finances, secret bank accounts, offshore holdings, a string of investigations, apologies and quiet exiles. Spain's monarchy wasn't just aging, it was leaking. But it all started here, with a handball player turned duke who thought he could launder money through non-profit dinners and royal titles, and no one would notice. They noticed, the court noticed, the country noticed, and the Spanish crown, once draped in post-dictatorship grace, began its long slide into scandal fatigue.
And as the cameras flashed outside the courtroom and the former golden couple walked past protest signs, one thing became clear. The fairy tale was over. The monarchy had joined the rest of the country, not as saviours, but as suspects.